So we want such an error modal. Now, a modal is simply this overlay box, and for me that's a UI element we could be using in different parts of the app. This, of course, is a trivial app that has only one part, but we're always thinking from the perspective of potentially bigger apps. Therefore, I'll add it in the UI folder because such an error modal could be a reusable UI element. So I'll add my error modal.js file in there. And in that file, we of course import React from React. We got our error modal here, which gets props. And we export this like that. Now that's the first step. Now the second step is of course to fill that with some life. And generally it's totally up to you how you want to structure your modal. I actually want to reuse that card. So I'll import card from card like this and use this as a wrapper for the entire modal because I like that rounded corners look and so on. I want to use that therefore. Now inside of that card, my modal should have different sections. I want to have a header with the h2 tag where we actually can output some title. Now below that, I want to have a div which holds my main content, and in there a paragraph with the error message I want to display eventually. And below that, a footer. Now in that footer, I want to have a button which we can click to close the modal. So for that, I'll import button from /button to also reuse this component. And this shows this reusability of components. We're using the card in various places of the app. We're using the button in different places of the app. And we only defined these components and their styles once, and we can build our entire UI with these reusable building blocks. That's really the heart and the core idea, or one of the core ideas of React. So we got the button here, and hence in the footer, we can add such a button and say OK or something like that on it, so that this is our close the modal button in the end. Now, between the h2 tags here, I want to have some title, and of course that modal should be configurable from outside. I don't want to hard code the title and the message into this component. It should also be reusable, so that we can use it in different places of the app to show different error messages. Hence here I output something dynamic between curly braces and use, let's say, props.title. Again, it's your component. You can use any prop name you want here, but I expect to get a title prop which holds the text which should be output here. Now between the paragraphs, I want to output props.message so that we also expect a message prop which, well, holds the message that should be output here. And I also want some styling. For that attached, you find the error modal.module.css file, and you can again just drag that into your UI folder next to the error modal.js file, and then import it here. Import classes from /error modal.module.css. Because I'm also using CSS modules here to have unique class names, and there are a couple of classes that should be attached. For example here, on the card itself, I want to add the classes.modal class, which is one of the classes defined here in the CSS file. In addition, on the header, I want to have the classes.header class. And on that div that surrounds the paragraph, I will add the classes.content class. On the footer, we'll also add a class, and that's the classes.actions class. And these are all CSS classes predefined in that CSS file. With that, we'll have a basic modal, and we can already see that in action. The question is, where do we want to render it? As part of which component? And you can actually argue about that. You can argue that it should be rendered inside of add user, because ultimately it will be this component that will trigger the modal. You could also argue that it's a general overlay over the entire UI, and therefore logically it should be rendered as high as possible in the component tree. Something like inside of the app component or anything like that. Now, I will go for the place where it actually is being caused, and that would be the add user component, but you can definitely also pick a different place. You then, of course, will need to update your state management appropriately. I will write state management code that ensures that it works here inside of the add user component. So here I want to output my error modal, and therefore we have to import it, of course. So we go here and import error modal from UI error modal. Now we also need to configure it. We need to set a title, and we'll soon set this dynamically, but now I'll set it to an error occurred and a message, which we can set to something went wrong. But this will not work, and do you know why? I briefly touched on it in the debugging section. Well, if we try to save this, we'll get an error. We'll get the error that we got adjacent JSX elements and that this is not allowed, basically. Indeed, React doesn't allow two side-by-side components being rendered directly as a root element of your return statement, and you therefore need to wrap this, for example, in an extra div. We'll later see a different solution for this. For now, we'll just take an extra div and put our error modal and our card into that div, so that the div is returned by the return statement, and then inside of the div, we can have adjacent elements. And with that, it compiles, and if you reload, hey, this doesn't look too bad. We got our modal here. Now, of course, it's not dynamic. Of course, we can't close it right now. And of course, one crucial thing is missing, and that's a backdrop for the modal. So an overlay between this modal overlay and the actual main page, so that we can't interact with the rest of the main page, which currently is possible. So, to make sure we can't interact with the rest of the page, back in the error modal, I'll add an extra div next to the card, not inside of it, but next to it. And therefore, as you just learned, we need a general div that wraps both that extra div and the card. And on that extra div, I'll add a class, and that's the classes.backdrop class. The div itself is empty, but this backdrop CSS class makes sure that we have this grayish, black, transparentish background behind the modal. If we now save everything, you can see the background here, and now I can't interact with the form anymore, for example. So with that, we got the modal in place. Now, of course, the goal is to show it only sometimes, only if we do try to submit invalid data, and of course, we want to make sure that we can also dismiss it.